His previous book, A Chequered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon, won the Kamaladevi, Chattopadhyay, and IF Book Prize in 2020. So welcome, Jairam. We are going to be discussing his book, which is the book he's published on Edwin Arnold's epic poem, The Light of Asia, which retells the story of Buddha. And he's going to tell us a little bit about why he came to discuss this book. In discussion with him is a good friend and colleague of mine from Pondicherry, Dr. Peter Heath, who's an independent scholar based in India. He has written and edited 11 books and published more than 50 articles. His publication includes The Lives of Sri Aurobindo, Columbia University Press, 2008, Indian Religions, a historical reader of spiritual expression and experience, New York University Press, 2002, Nationalism, Terrorism, Communalism, which is printed in 1998 and republished several times. And the book that I really still advocate to my students, The Bomb in Bengal, The Rise of Revolutionary Terrorism in India, 1900 to 1910, a book that I would advise all of you to look at if you haven't looked at. So welcome to two amazing historians, speakers, and certainly in the case of Jairam Ramesh, a very well-known public figure. So the way in which this format is going to be is that Jairam will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and Peter Heath will be promised a conversation, and Peter will be in conversation with him. We've got 2 hours slotted, but we will be there for about, as long as it takes for us to discuss this book properly. So thank you very much, and over to you. Thank you to Mike as well for organizing this, and he'll be the master of ceremonies.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Vinita. Thank you, Peter. I'm delighted that we're having this conversation on my new book, which has just come out. Here's the cover. So it's a beautiful cover. The Light of Asia, the poem that defined the Buddha. It has a foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And this is a 2-in-1 biography. It's a biography of a poem that was first published in 1879 that popularized the life of the Buddha. It brought into the public domain in England, in America, in Europe, and in other parts of Asia, including the subcontinent, Siddhartha's birth, his search for the enlightenment, and finally his attaining enlightenment and becoming the Buddha, and the essence of his messages. So that's one part of the biography of the poem. Why did it have the impact that it had? Why did it become a sensation? Why did it influence so many personalities across the world? Why did it influence social reform movements in parts of India? And why did it get translated and still continues to get translated? It's got already 30 languages and counting. So this is one aspect of this biography. The second aspect of the biography is Sir Edwin Arnold himself, a journalist, an educationist, who was a polyglot, knew Sanskrit, Marathi, Arabic, Turkish, Greek, Latin, French, German, remarkable felicity with languages. And so Edwin Arnold spent 2 years in India after the First War of Indian Independence or the Great Mutiny, depending on which way you look at it. He was in India in 1858 and 1859. He was principal of the Deccan College. He was principal of the Pune College, which became the Deccan College. And he ended up translating a large number of very, very well-known and seminal Sanskrit works. He translated the Hitopadesha, he translated the Gita Govinda, he translated the Mahabharata, and most importantly, in 1885, he translated the Bhagavad Gita as the song Celestial. And this Bhagavad Gita, the song Celestial, became the starting point for a young man in London called Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And the song Celestial became Mahatma Gandhi's abiding text till his assassination in January of 1948. So Sir Edwin Arnold was a Victorian figure, an imperialist, a believer in British rule in India, however, a man deeply, deeply captivated and enamored of India's spiritual, philosophical, and literary legacy. An early Orientalist, long before the word Orientalist became a term of abuse. He was truly an Orientalist. He translated Persian works, Sadi, Gulistan. He translated from the Quran the 99 names of Allah. He, of course, translated the Sanskrit works that I mentioned. And in the last 20 years of his life, after marrying a Japanese woman, he started translating Japanese works as well. So a very remarkable personality, died in 1904, but a Victorian in every sense of the term. Considered to be a minor poet, not a scholar by any stretch of imagination, not an archaeologist like Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, not like James Prinsep, who deciphered the script, the Brahmi script, not a Max Muller, not a Monia Williams or a H.H. Wilson. However, he did more than any other scholar or academic in England in the late 19th century to popularize and propagate Indian literature. And of course, his Light of Asia of 1879 became a milestone, an early milestone, perhaps the first or second milestone in Buddhist historiography. It's not a popular poem. I asked Richard Gombrich, one of the world's greatest scholars of Buddhism, who's in Oxford. I asked him, Dr. Gombrich, what do you have to say about the Light of Asia? So he told me, Mr. Ramesh, I read it when I was a small boy, and I've not read it thereafter. But I knew why it had an impact when it was first published. So I think that's the reason why I wrote this biography. I had written 3 political biographies in the past, in the last 3 years, as Vinita mentioned. So I wanted to do a different type of a biography. And that's how I, started working on this biography of a poem, which I had read when I was very young. And it had remained with me. Buddha is part of every Indian's life. Buddha is part of our DNA, even if we are not Buddhists in the formal, ritualistic, religious sense of the term. We all learn about the Buddha. We are brought up steeped in knowledge of the life of the Buddha. So this was the background to why I wrote this book. I wanted to do something different, but there were two other important reasons which I want to mention right at the beginning. While I was going through some of the old archives, the archives that I have of the old correspondence of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, I discovered 2 letters from Winston Churchill to Nehru in 1955. First in April 1955, and subsequently, a month or 2 later, June of 1955. And in both these letters, Churchill, the Indiaphobe, the man Indians love to hate, Churchill was writing to India's prime minister, saying that you've got a heavy task, you've got a big challenge, a heavy burden on your shoulders. Remember the Light of Asia. So twice, in 2 months, in 2 letters, Churchill draws attention to Buddha, and Buddha being an inspiration for Nehru, and he uses the phrase Light of Asia, obviously derived from Edwin Arnold's poem and Churchill's own knowledge of it. So I found that very intriguing, and I said if it could have influenced Churchill for him to remember when he was at the fag end of his life, let me try to trace out the diverse influences that it may have had on other personalities, and I discovered that. The second reason why I wrote this book is because for the last 35 years, the control over the birthplace of Lord Rama has been the defining issue of Indian politics, what's called the Ayodhya Dispute, the dispute between the Hindus and the Muslims. Now, before the Ayodhya Dispute was an equally acrimonious dispute on the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha, or the Siddhartha became the Buddha, where Siddhartha got enlightenment and came to be known as the Buddha. The Mahabodhi temple was under the control of Hindu priests, Shaivite priests. And after the publication of the poem in 1879, and Edwin Arnold's writings and his own trip to Bodh Gaya in February of 1886, where he was appalled and anguished by the desecration of what he considered to be the Mecca of Buddhism by these Hindu priests. He started a campaign for transferring the control of the Mahabodhi temple to Buddhist communities represented by the Mahabodhi Society, which had then been founded in Calcutta. And this, the poem and Edwin Arnold's visit to Bodh Gaya triggered a 70-year agitation, which was launched by a Sri Lankan monk who is considered to be the founder of modern Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, Angarika Dharmapala. And finally, is only in May of 1953 that the control of the Mahabodhi temple, the spot where Buddha received his, where Siddhartha received his enlightenment, became the Buddha, was transferred from the Hindu priests to a committee. In typical Indian style, 50% of the members of the committee would be Hindus, 50% of the committee would be Buddhists, and the local administrator, the district administrator, would be the chairman. And when this transfer took place in May of 1953, verses from the Light of Asia were recited. So I found that, the Bodh Gaya dispute and the Ayodhya dispute, are disputes over the control of sacred spaces. And I thought it would be interesting to look at the Bodh Gaya dispute, the Mahabodhi dispute, how it started, how it evolved, and how it got resolved, particularly in view of the fact that, we have had this Ayodhya issue on the political agenda for so many years, and it got resolved really through the Supreme Court intervention only 2 years ago. So broadly speaking, this is the reason why I wrote this book. This book is not a catharsis for COVID-19. This is a book I would have written even if there was no lockdown. It just so happened that there was a lockdown last year. It gave me an opportunity for doing some concentrated research and writing over a 6-month period, which I did. But it really, no biographer will write a biography unless he or she has some empathy with the subject. There must be some special relationship. A biographer will have either a special love or a visceral hate for the subject, and then only a biography will come. Peter Heath is a great student of Sri Aurobindo, and that's why he has produced this masterly biography of Sri Aurobindo. So unless you have a special relationship with the subject, you'll not write a biography. And as I said, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not a scholar of Buddhism, but like every Indian, decisively and profoundly influenced by the personality of the Buddha. I don't think you can go to any Indian home, middle-class Indian home, without finding this in the drawing room or the living room or the bedroom or some room in the house. In every Indian's house, you'll find this little, a stone carving or a painting, or some representation of the Buddha. So Buddha is very much part of our existence, even though we may neglect his teachings, even though we may not follow his teachings of compassion, of understanding, of harmony, and so on and so forth. So let me stop here, and we can develop some of these themes. The poem, to encapsulate the reason why the poem became the sensation it became, it focused on the humanity of the Buddha. It didn't focus on the divinity of Buddha. It came at a time of terrific scientific advance. It came at a time when there was growing doubt and skepticism about organized religion. It came at a time when there was economic prosperity and people were wanting some source of solace, some source of personal morality and personal ethics, which did not impose on them, a dogma or a creed. And I think in Buddha, Edwin Arnold succeeded in projecting a Christ-like figure. Didn't focus on any miracles that the Buddha accomplished, but he simply focused on his life. And I think that's created, there was a need, people were looking for some figure to hold on to, and the poem came, and I think it became the sensation because of the subject of the poem, because people were looking for a Buddha-like figure, and Edwin Arnold took out the Buddha from the arcane world of archaeology, from the world of the Oxfords and the Cambridges, from the academic world, and he wrote a popular work which resonated across the world. Finally, let me say that in India, particularly, beginning in the early part of the 20th century, the life of the Buddha was seen to be the life of a social revolutionary. And therefore, when this Light of Asia got translated into many Indian languages, a large number of social reformers used the poem to propagate the notion of a reform of the Indian caste system. They fought Brahminical orthodoxy in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, and finally, of course, we had one of the greatest Indians of the 20th century, Dr. Ambedkar, who formally converted into Buddhism in 1956. But these were all people who were profoundly influenced, who were inspired by the life of the Buddha as a political reformer, as a social reformer, and they came to the knowledge of the Buddha through the poem that Edwin Arnold wrote. So Buddha was a cultural figure, he was a figure, a historical figure to people like Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore, Vivekananda, but there were many Indians who also saw Buddha as a social revolutionary, and that's one of the great messages that comes out of the final pages of the poem. So Vinita, I mean, this by way of an
Yeah.
introduction, I think should suffice. So I pass it on over to you.
Jairam, just to say, are you happy to read an extract from your book? Of
Well, I would, towards the end, I would like to read the last few lines of the
yes,
poem.
of the
which
poem. Then did
because that,
Siddhartha.
those
Yeah.
4 or 5 lines were the lines that, made the poem the blockbuster that it became. So I'll do that towards the later part of
Yeah,
our.
after Peter sort of.
But
Okay, so that'd be very nice to context. A lot of people here haven't read the poem, I imagine. So just contextualizing the blank verse and how Edwin Arnold does this would be very interesting for us. Okay, so over to you, Peter. Yeah.
Right, Vinita, thanks very much. And thank you, Jairam Ramesh, for that illuminating summary of your book. I'm afraid I'm not so good at extemporaneous speaking, so I've actually written my comments. And I had the idea in the beginning that I was going to give a response in seminar style, which would have meant like a 15-minute response followed by questions. It seemed though that would have me talking a little bit too much. So I've broken up my comments into 3 parts, after each of which I hope Mr. Ramesh has some things he would like to say about them. Does that seem like a good way to proceed?
Sure, I'm open to whatever way Vinita fits.
Okay, so again, sorry, I'm going to be reading most of it, at least for the prepared part. Then later we can be a little more relaxed. So first, as a historian, I'd like to compliment you on the breadth of your research. You've delved deep into the literary, cultural, religious, and political history of your period, drawing on primary texts, scholarly books and articles, dissertations, and works of popular culture. This interdisciplinary approach has given your book unusual range and depth. Those of you who have not yet read Mr. Ramesh's book will be astonished to learn the influence that the Light of Asia has had in many fields for more than 140 years. And here I'll just be underlining some points that Mr. Ramesh has already made. It was the first popular treatment of Buddhism to have a major impact in the West and has been translated into a dozen European languages. its impact on Asia was equally great, with translations in 8 East Asian and 14 South Asian languages. The Indians who were influenced by it make up a roll call of the great men of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among them, Vivekananda, Gandhi, Nehru, C.V. Raman, B.R. Ambedkar, and Kumaran Asan, a disciple of Narayana Guru. Works based on the poem were important landmarks in Bengali, Marathi, and Malayalam literature. Its themes were depicted in European and Indian paintings and enacted in Western and Indian plays and films. Mr. Ramesh's biography is a narrative account of the writing and diffusion of the Light of Asia. He also alludes briefly to certain critical questions that arose when the book was published and remain of interest today. Since this book launch is taking place in an academic setting, I think it appropriate to take up some of these questions and give the author a chance to expand on them more fully. So now I have about a, say, 5-minute kind of background of leading to my first question, which has to do with the political context. It provides background about this political question, and most of the background I'm taking directly from Mr. Ramesh's book. As he's already mentioned, Arnold was appointed principal of the Pune College, later the Deccan College, by the India Office in 1857. He remained in the country for less than 4 years, during which time the rule of the country passed from the East India Company to the Crown. At that time, Arnold was an enthusiastic supporter of Britain's imperial mission, and he remained so for the 40 years he was associated with the Daily Telegraph, a gung-ho imperialist newspaper, and indeed until the end of his life. In India, as Mr. Ramesh mentioned, Arnold mastered Sanskrit and Marathi and developed a lasting admiration for India and its people. But there was always, it seems to me, there was always something patronizing in his attitude. In the preface of his translation of the Hitopadesha, which the author mentioned, he wrote, "A residence in India and close intercourse with the Hindus has given the author a lively desire to subserve their advancement." But at this very same time, he wrote, "The hope of Hindustan lies in the intelligent interest of England." He wanted the Light of Asia and the Indian Song of Songs, the translation of the Gita Govinda, to, quote, preserve the memory of one who loved India and the Indian people. But he never showed the least support for the Indian national movement, in which other Englishmen, such as Octavian Hume and William Webber, played an active role. As late as 1892, Arnold wrote that India might be capable of managing its own affairs at some far-off day. Mr. Ramesh is, of course, aware of these contradictions. I've taken these quotations from his book. But he rarely pauses his fast-moving narrative to consider the implications of Arnold's colonial mindset, consider at length, let's say. This is something that historians of the colonial world increasingly feel the need to do. Farah Daboiwala, in an article published in this month's New York Review of Books, writes of the still entrenched idea that, quote, whatever its past or present shortcomings, the British Empire was a profoundly moral undertaking whose spread benefited countless subject peoples. And as you all know, current attempts to question this idea cause alarm in certain circles in the UK and the USA. But as Priya Satya wrote in a piece published last month, reckoning with the history of colonialism is essential to reckoning with colonialism itself. So where do Arnold and his light fit into this history? Are we to say with Edward Said that his scholarship and his writing about India, not excluding the Light of Asia, were part and parcel of the colonial empire, colonial enterprise. Certain things Arnold wrote are classic examples of Orientalism in the Sahidian sense. For example, this passage from a lecture of 1893. A dignified calm spreads throughout the Oriental populations, a permanent, uninquiring placidity. India would never indeed have invented the locomotive or the Gatling gun, but her poorest peasants, by inheritance from profound philosophies and by the religious atmosphere of their land, stand at a point of view far beyond the labored subtleties of a Priestley or Hegel. It's hard to tell whether that was a compliment or an insult. The philosophy of the Buddha and the religion that was built on his teachings underlie much of what Arnold called the religious atmosphere of India. How did he represent this Buddhist heritage? That will be my second question, but before I go into that, I'm sure that Mr. Ramesh will be happy to share his ideas about Arnold and the colonial world he lived in.
Well, Peter, I'm a narrator. I'm not a deconstructor. I'm a writer. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I
would dispute that, but go ahead.
But my objective,
not being a historian.
I have a slightly different take on this than maybe an unpopular take, and certainly in the Indian context, given the fact that I'm in Indian politics, an unpopular stance to take. And I differ from my own colleague Shashi Tharoor in this regard. I believe that there was a generation of scholars who were imperialists, very much embedded in the idea of Britain's manifest destiny to bring modernity to India, but at the same time, were quite enraptured and captivated by India's civilization legacy. I don't think that Edwin Arnold set out to write this poem to justify British rule in India. I don't think he translated the Bhagavad Gita. He sat down and he thought to himself, how do I justify British rule in India? Let me translate the Bhagavad Gita into English. So this is the fundamental problem I have, with all the scholars, who use these texts divorced. Of course, the times were imperialist times, Peter. Of course, he was an apologist for empire. Of course, he had some very strange notions he was not a believer in home rule for Ireland. He certainly did not believe in home rule for India. Immediately, he thought that ultimately the Britishers would have to leave India, but he left that time span undefined. But I do believe this is my personal view, Peter, we do gross injustice to this generation of scholars who really unearthed Indian treasures, which India had forgotten or had been taken for granted. And it was up to this generation of British scholars, aided, of course, by many number of Europeans and their Indian associates as well, which enabled India to rediscover a lost literary, a lost philosophical, and a lost cultural legacy. So it's easy to be judgmental today, Peter. It's easy to look at these texts as colonial empire texts. I'm not in that game. I'm not. My idea in writing this book was, I want to be happy when I write a book. I don't want to be angry when I write a book. I don't want to be critical when I write a book. I want to tell a story. I want to bring the facts in front of the people and let people make up their own minds.
No, so that was everything. And you created a very engaging narrative, and just along the way, you sometimes sort of raised a couple of these points, and I'm kind of underlining them without necessarily citing either with the Saidians on the one hand or the apologists for empire on the other. But I think, so in that sense, I agree with your general approach, but there are these contradictions. There does seem to be a kind of patronizing attitude. And I think it was something that had to be recaptured by Indians of a later generation to tell their own story. And you've shown that that's exactly what happened, I think. When when that work was not only, go ahead.
Was that generation patronizing? Undoubtedly, Peter. Edwin Arnold, undoubtedly. Even Max Muller, if you look at some of Max Muller's writings, if you look at Alexander Cunningham's reports of his archaeological expeditions at Sarnath and Barhut and Bodh Gaya, there is an element of patronizing attitude that comes across. But at the same time, I mean, let me give you a simple example, which I'm sure would have struck you. I found it, in fact, the only value judgment I have made in this entire book is on Arnold's stance on sati. Arnold glorifies sati. Mm-hmm. He takes issue. He's critical of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. He's critical of Sir William Bentinck. He's critical of the British colonial intervention to make sati illegal. And he says sati is the noblest of values. Sati represents love, it represents loyalty, it represents chastity, and goes to the extent of, unearthing the fact that the Romans also practiced bride burning. And, he said the Hindus were not the only community or civilization that had bride. I mean, that's the only place where I really, I was angry. I said, how could a man, a modern man, educated man, a scientific man, rational man, a great admirer of Buddha, the supreme rationalist, come up with this extraordinary defense of the indefensible? Now, but for the most part, I've tried not to be judgmental on him, not really to be judgmental on him. He was a colonial figure, no doubt. I've said he's a creature of his times, and people, I have not defined those times. Those times were Victorian, the late Victorian era. It was the high noon of British rule in India. And the fact that he had no contact with the Indian National Congress, he did not meet Dadabhai Naoroji, who was living in London at this, roughly the same time. They had no contact. I mean, they must have met, but there was nowhere, at no point of time did Edwin Arnold say that, India is a country, which is ripe, or we should work towards home rule for India. He never said that. But I don't think that was his intention. His intention was, he was so much in love with Sanskrit. He was so much in love with these books that I think he spent all his time, other than writing thundering editorials in favor of Benjamin Disraeli and the Tory position in the Daily Telegraph, he spent all his other time translating all these Oriental, so-called quote-unquote Oriental texts. And he was an early Orientalist. In 1915, there was a book that was published in Madras by a very well-known publisher called G.A. Natesan and Company. He was the India's best-known publisher. In 1915, this book came out. It was called Eminent Orientalists. Now, this was an Indian publisher who brought out a book called Eminent Orientalists. And there were a large number of them. There were about 20 odd people. William Jones was there. Edwin Arnold was there. Sister Nivedita she was the only woman in that list. Of course, this was much before the word Orientalist became a term of, criticism, or a term which had negative connotations, so to speak.
Right. Just about Sati and various Orientalists, Nivedita was also a glorifier of Sati.
Yes.
And kind of embarrassing to read what she said about it.
Absolutely.
Should I go on to the next point?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right, I'll try to summarize more. So Arnold, as we know, took his Buddha from a variety of sources. He underlined his indebtedness to an English translation of a Chinese translation of the Sanskrit Abhinishkramana Sutra, but he also drew heavily on manuals compiled by the British missionaries R. Spence Hardy and Paul Begrandet, who based themselves on Sinhala and Burmese sources. He may have consulted some Sanskrit and Pali texts, but for the most part, he encountered the Buddha through the work of British scholars, some of whom were not terribly sympathetic towards Buddhism. As you mentioned, he made a Buddha that was pleasing to his audience. He did not stress the supernatural element, even though all sources did. He, as you say, stressed the human side of the Buddha, and that's what made a poem so appealing to Western readers. And again, as you pointed out, many critics have shown that Arnold's Buddha had more than passing resemblance to the Jesus of 19th century Protestantism. Arnold's Buddha opposed the orthodoxy of the Brahmins, just like Jesus of the Bible opposed the Jewish orthodoxy of his time. So in both cases, we have with an exemplary moral teacher whose life was a model of self-sacrifice. We even find that Arnold's Buddha was aware of social Darwinism, the main intellectual concern of Victorian England. So he has the young Buddha, when he goes forth to the palace, meeting not only the traditional triad of disease, old age, and death, but, I quote here, life living upon death, one vast, savage, grim conspiracy of mutual murder, from the worm to man who himself kills his fellow. Now, of course, every interpreter of an old tradition sees it in the light of the present. His Buddha is not the Buddha we find in the Pali Suttas, and neither would have been recognizable to a Mahayana scholar like Nagarjuna or a Japanese seeker of the Pure Land. But he was immediately recognizable to Arnold's Victorian readers, also surprisingly, to English-knowing readers in colonial India. So my question here is, how do you feel about the Victorian qualities of Arnold's Buddha? You're aware that he framed his poem to suit his audience. Was this just the sort of thing any conscientious author might do to reach out to his audience? Or does it constitute a sort of cultural appropriation?
Well, Peter, as you have pointed out, there were multiple sources for Arnold's Buddha. There were multiple sources for this poem. There was the French translations of Chinese texts, which in turn were translations of Sanskrit texts that had long been lost. There were English translations of Chinese texts, and there were English translations of Pali texts. Rhys Davids, work from the Pali text, Foucault's work on the Lalita Vistara, a seminal work in Buddhist literature and Buddhist philosophy. So he was eclectic. He didn't have one view. He took, I could identify, unlike previous scholars who have identified one source for Arnold, I have identified at least 6 different sources for the poem. And some of them come from Pali, some of them are derived from the Chinese texts, basically the Chinese texts and the Pali texts. He was aware of some Sanskrit texts, and I think the 2 years that he spent in Pune, remember that all his interlocutors, all his Indian interlocutors were Brahmins. I mean, he interacted only with a very tiny layer of Indian society, which was comfortable with Sanskrit. And that's how he really developed his knowledge of Sanskrit. And he had some idea of Buddha in Sanskrit literature, because he had already translated the Gita Govinda, which is the first Sanskrit text, the 12th century Sanskrit text, which portrays Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu. The Brahmins had by then appropriated the greatest threat that Brahmanism faced in the man in the shape of Buddha and his teachings. So he had multiple sources. He was not a Christian or an Anglican, in the institutional sense of the term. When he was in Oxford, he had already written that the paths to truth are many. He was a religious skeptic. He was not a churchgoer. He was no great, he had no great fixation. But I think, of course, he wanted to make the life of the Buddha acceptable. And to that extent, absolutely right, that he painted Buddha as I said, a pre-Christ, Christ-like figure, minus the miracles associated with the life of Christ. And that's why I said that Arnold's poem's greatest contribution is to focus on the humanity of Buddha and not on the divinity of Buddha. And I think that's where his great contribution lay. And of course, the fact that Arnold was the first person to give a completely positive interpretation to the idea of nirvana, which was seen as a nihilistic, as a negative, as a passive idea. And it was Arnold's poem that really propagated the idea of nirvana as something part of an active search, which all of us, there is no one nirvana. Everybody finds his or her own nirvana. And that's the essential message of the Buddha. And that's what got popularized in this long epic poem. And it then became part of conventional wisdom. So there are parts, it's interesting, Peter. The Brahmins loved this poem, but so did the anti-Brahmins. The Brahmins loved this poem, talking Shiva, Vishnu, Om, Gayatri Mantra. He paid obeisance, to all the Brahminical icons. But there are sections there, where Siddhartha, a young untouchable boy wants to give water to Siddhartha, and he's very reluctant. And Siddhartha says, "Why are you reluctant?" He says, "I'm an untouchable." Then Siddhartha gives him a long lecture on this bogusness of the idea of untouchability and how this idea of caste is a complete, we should fight against the idea of caste. So that's why the anti-Brahmin social reformers saw this as an inspirational poem. So, it's an extraordinary poem. It appealed to the Brahmins. The Brahmins didn't criticize it. The only people critical of this poem, Peter, were the Christian missionaries, because they felt that Buddha was being popularized at the expense of Christ. That, the light was the Christ. And in fact, Edwin Arnold was forced because he desperately wanted to be the poet laureate. And the only way he could appease the British establishment was to put Christ on a higher pedestal than Buddha. So he wrote The Light of the World in 1891. He called Buddha Light of Asia and he called Christ Light of the World. But Light of the World fell flat. It didn't sell. It didn't create any impact. It's the Light of Asia that became a publishing and a literary and a cultural phenomenon. So yes, he saw Buddha in the reformist avatar. And I think that's what gave a lot of importance and weight to the poem.
Thanks. I think wasn't it Munir Williams himself who said something to the effect of, "Oh, the light of Asia," but then next to that, it's nothing next to the light of the world.
Yes.
In other words, Christ. And
incidentally,
that maybe
there were large number of British scholars, of which Munir Williams was one of the prime examples, who believed that Hinduism was a better religion quote unquote, than Buddhism, because Buddhism was negative, Buddhism was passive, Buddhism preached withdrawal, whereas Hinduism was much more of an active engagement with society. And Monia Williams, actually in his gradation, Christianity is number one, Hinduism is number two, and Buddhism is at the very bottom. So yeah, I mean, he faced these academic critics, but the most important critics that he faced were the Christian missionaries. And remember, Peter, when he was principal of Pune College, he was very critical of the Scottish missionaries' activity in Pune. He was very critical of the conversion movement that was then overtaking the western part of India, western part of the peninsular India, and he was very critical of the Christian missionaries. So his relationship with the Christian church and the Christian establishment was very, very tense and very ambivalent.
Thanks. I'll go ahead to the next question.
Sure.
So that's about the form of the poem, and that's something that also appealed very much to his English readership. The form followed that of Tennyson's Idylls of the King, Matthew Arnold's Sohrab and Rustum, and especially Milton's Paradise Lost. The parallel was so obvious that an early critic joked that The Light of Asia was actually Idylls of the Buddha. So he used blank verse, the form that had been used since the 16th century for long poems where the poet wanted to develop something at length. And that was it's hard for us to realize today that long narrative poems had the cachet in those days that literary fiction does today. So a writer, someone like Tennyson was a bestseller every time he published a book. It was also a time when books about the Orient, the exotic East, were a big thing. Byron's Eastern Tales, Coleridge's Kubla Khan, Shelley's The Revolt of Asia, and especially Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. All of them poems not about the actual Orient, but Europe dressed up in Oriental clothing. And it's often been pointed out that Fitzgerald avoided some criticism of his skeptical point of view by putting it all in the mouth of a Persian poet of the 11th century. But how did it come about? The Light of Asia was something similar, but unlike the Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat, people in India and other parts of Asia took to Arnold's poem and in a way used this Western, this interpretation of a Western writer as a way to approach their own religion. I had the thought that it's, have you heard of what Agyananda Bharati calls the pizza effect?
Yes.
Well, that for those who don't know it, that's when a cultural product that's exported to another country becomes a prestige item when it's re-imported to the original country as pizza, which originally was just a way of serving up leftovers, became almost a gourmet item when re-exported from the United States to Italy. So I want to read a passage from your book here that kind of points up this re-importation paradox. It has to do with how Dharman Kosambi encountered the Buddha in G.N. Kane's Marathi translation of The Light of Asia. Kosambi mentioned this to the great Sanskrit scholar R.G. Bhandarkar. Bhandarkar replied, "Oh, I know that book by Kane. It is the translation I'm reading now from The Light of Asia by Jairam Ramesh. I know that book by Kane. It is a translation of an English book. The English book does not express even a quarter of the original, and not a quarter of the English is expressed in the Marathi. And you have formed your opinion about Buddhism on the basis of such a book?" To which Kosambi replied, "I admit I know nothing about Buddhism, but if the Marathi account, which according to you contains only 1/16 of the original, is so gripping, one can only imagine how good the original must be. And of course, Kosambi went on to become one of India's greatest Pali and Sanskrit scholars. So the moral of the story may be that the message is more important than the messenger.
Well, Peter, since you mentioned
Yeah.
Dharmanand Kosambi, I just
Yeah.
want to make a comment which would interest all of you. Dharmanand Kosambi came to Buddha through the Marathi translation of the Light of Asia. But Dharmanand Kosambi was one of two Indians, only one of two Indians who rejected the conventional view of why Siddhartha sought enlightenment. This is, what can be called the four sides view. All of us are taught, and the Light of Asia, Edwin Arnold also has chapter and verse on this, that Siddhartha first saw a cripple, he was very anguished. Then he saw an old man, he was doubly anguished. Then he saw a corpse, he was triply anguished. Then he saw a monk, and then he realized, there's something, I need to discover. Then he gave up his wife, he gave up his son, he went on to the path of enlightenment, and he became the Buddha. Every person in the world that I know, including the great Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, you name it. You and I and Vinita and Michael, whatever we know about Buddha, the four sides view is the traditional view of why Siddhartha sought enlightenment. But Kosambi was the first of two Indians, the other Indian being Dr. Ambedkar, who derived his knowledge from Kosambi, who said that Siddhartha got pained and anguished because his father's tribe and his mother's tribe, they belonged to two different tribes, were fighting over control over water. And he tried to mediate and bring about reconciliation between the two tribes. Their tribes would not listen to him. He was completely frustrated and in sheer disgust decided to leave his princely abode and search for the meaning of life. In other words, this is a quasi-Marxist interpretation, of
Is there
why.
any documentary basis for that?
Well, that Siddhartha sought enlightenment because of the war over some material aspect of life, which was water.
But was there such a war at all?
Yes, and the other view, of course, is is the romantic view, which is the four sides and which is embodied in the poem. So Dharmanand Kosambi, who was the greatest scholar in my view of Pali in the first half of the 20th century, and Ambedkar, who wrote a book called The Buddha and His Dhamma, which was published after he passed away in December 1956. It was published posthumously. The difference between Ambedkar and Gandhi, the difference between Ambedkar and Nehru, the difference between Ambedkar and Vivekananda or Tagore is that for these Indians, Buddha was a cultural figure, was a philosophical figure, was a spiritual figure, was a moral figure. But for Ambedkar and Kosambi, Buddha was a political figure. He was a figure who was, taking on the caste, and he was moved by not what he saw, but what he actually experienced in terms of battle between his father's tribe and his mother's tribe. So I think to that extent, Arnold's poem is in conventional. This is from the Pali texts. This is from the Chinese texts. This is from the Sanskrit texts. Who say that this is what Siddhartha saw, and that's why Siddhartha became very anguished, and he sought the meaning of life. So Arnold didn't challenge that view. This view was challenged only by Kosambi. And what I find interesting is that the view is challenged by a man who was introduced to the Buddha by reading The Light of Asia in its Marathi translation. That is what I find very, very interesting.
It is extremely interesting. So I don't have any more prepared things to say, or I can drop them. Do you think, Vinita, it's time to open up to further questions for people can direct to?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was exceedingly interesting, especially teased out a lot of the wealth of knowledge that's gone behind the creation of this book, and of course also exhibited Peter Heech's own tremendous sort of understanding of Buddhism as well. So I just wondered whether, Jairam, you wanted to read an extract now before we open it up? Yeah.
Well, I just want to read, this Light of Asia is divided into 8 books, the original poem. It's about 40,000 lines. So it's really an epic poem. And it's, some poems are to be read. Some poems are meant to be recited. Some poems are meant to be declaimed and elocuted. And I think the Light of Asia, you'll find it boring if you read it. But it's, when it's elocuted, when it's actually read out, declaimed, it acquires why even today in Sri Lanka, every year, an organization called the YMBA, the Young Men Buddhist Association, which was started along the lines of the YMCA, holds an annual elocution contest for school children in Sri Lanka who they are asked to recite verses from the Light of Asia as a test of their memory, as a test of their knowledge of the life of the Buddha, and as a test of their skills in elocution. So I think this is what gives this poem, a sort of its uniqueness. So let me read just the last lines of this poem. Ah, blessed Lord, O high deliverer, forgive this feeble script which doth thee wrong, measuring with little wit thy lofty love. Ah, lover, brother, guide, lamp of the law, I take my refuge in thy name and thee. I take my refuge in thy law of good. I take my refuge in thy order. Om. And then there's the last 4 lines, which really made the poem the sensation it became. The dew is on the lotus, rise, great sun, and lift my leaf and mix me with the wave. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. The sunrise comes. The dewdrop slips into the shining sea. And that's how the poem ends. This Om Mani Padme Hum is the sort of the mantra which the Dalai Lama also periodically uses in his public speeches and in his teachings and so on. So those are the last lines, and he keeps using words like Om. The Brahmins would be very happy. Every third word is an Om. Every third word, the Ganesha. He talks of the Hindu icons. So I think that's how Arnold was able to create a constituency where Hindus love the book, the Buddhists love the book, many Christians, of course, love the book. Tolstoy, for example, a man like Tolstoy and Rudyard Kipling. For Rudyard Kipling, this became a favorite text. Not a good advertisement for the poem, but there it is. So it had something for everything. But ultimately, what it did, Peter and Vinita, it brought Buddha into our lives. It's one thing doing archaeological expeditions on Buddha. It's one thing writing academic papers on the Buddha. But educating the lay public on who the Buddha was and what he stood for, I think was Arnold's contribution through this poem.
Thank you very much. That's very, very exciting. Just before we open it up, I just wanted to say that, for me, it was very educational. I haven't read your book properly yet. I've just dipped into it. It seems to me that what Edwin Arnold was doing was sort of following in the tracks of the 18th century Orientalists, Holwell, Dow, and Jones. And then, in that sense, 19th century Orientalism very much sort of builds on the 18th century sort of traditions. I mean, Tao, of course, translated the Gita. And it's interesting to me when you say that it was Gandhi looked at the song Celestial. That was the version that he looked at. But the 18th century discovery of Hinduism was equally exuberant, was equally, was euphoric. For Jones, of course, as we know, the poetry of the Hindus was far exceeded anything, or equal the poetry of the classics, the Greeks and the Romans in some senses. So in that sense, he follows that tradition, though it's a very different 19th century tradition.
Gandhi comes to Hinduism through his reading of the song Celestial.
Yes.
And in this connection, I want to make one mention, Vinita, and Peter will agree with me. One organization or one body of men and women who played a profoundly important role in making Indians aware of their legacy was the Theosophical Society. In the late 19th century, in the early 20th century. Of course, there was a lot of mumbo jumbo associated, esoteric aspects associated with the Theosophical Society. But the Theosophical Society was a great popularizer of the light of Asia. Both in India as well as in Sri Lanka and in almost country after country. In America, you had the Transcendental Movement of Thoreau, of Emerson. They were all influenced really by the Light of Asia and the Theosophical Society. And Annie Besant is a figure almost forgotten today, but she was a very important figure, Vinita, in the pre-Gandhi era of Indian politics. Annie Besant and Bal Gangadhar Tilak were the two great figures after Sri Aurobindo had given up politics and taken to a life of spirituality and mysticism.